It's been long observed, including by me in last week's House of the Dragon episode 1, that the best scenes in Game of Thrones universe frequently features little more than a handful of well-dressed characters talking to one another in an opulent room. Before HBO realized that there was a gold in them in their Westerosi hills and upped the show's budget to a massive CGI battle levels, Game of Thrones was often content to let its characters talk things out, with George R.R. Martin's creative dialogues making its way past capable actors' lips. When you've got good storytelling, then there's no need to always devolve into a non-stop spectacle. The problem with House of the Dragon episode 2, The Rogue Prince, however, is that it doesn't quite have the same storytelling goods that the show's premiere did. This is an awkward hour of television that doesn't fully extinguish the show's hopes of being a worthy heir to the Iron Throne, but it does dim them for a bright future ahead. The Rogue Prince picks up roughly half a year after the conclusion of The Heirs of the Dragon. After storming off in an indignant huff, the titular Rogue Prince Daemon Targaryen has taken up at the Targaryens' ancestral home of Dragonstone. King Viserys and his councils are content to leave him with his own fucking tantrum there, even if it's symbolically fraught, as Dragonstone is supposed to be the seat of the king's true heir. But when Daemon announces his engagement to Lady Mysaria and steals a dragon egg for their eventual child, the king is forced to act, and by act I mean send Otto Hightower over the foggy isles of Dragonstone to glare at Daemon for a bit. While House of the Dragon has the sense of the historical fidelity of its source material imparted in episode 1 with the real sense of importance is that some historical approaches immediately runs into some issues with episode 2. Just like the real history of our world, we don't always know what happens behind closed doors of George R.R. Martin's fictional history, though in Fire and Blood, the history book upon which the House of the Dragon is based, Martin's maester characters are able to make some pretty educated guesses. A lot of those educated guesses made their way into the Heirs of the Dragon, and it's perhaps why the episode is so closely resembles the early seasons of Game of Thrones. Moments like Daemon referring to his dead nephew as heir for a day and exhilarating King's Landing's tourney or Maidenpool tourney in Fire and Blood are events that Martin's fictional maester have a lot of source for. The Rogue Prince, however, doesn't have many, if any, of those well-sourced scenes. As such, throughout this episode, the Westeros maester's voice, which is just I think George Martin, which is replaced by the show's best attempts at it, which are often less than inspiring. House of the Dragon's depiction of Dragonstone is certainly visually stunning and continues a welcome trend of the show, improving upon production design elements from Game of Thrones. But the action of the scene leaves so much to be dread. Daemon folds too far too quickly, and scene's dialogue doesn't really hold up, though the newly minted Kingsguard Sir Criston Cole reminds Daemon Targaryen of who knocked him off his fucking horse is admittedly really satisfying.
Sir Crispin, wasn't it?
Sir Criston Cole, my prince.
Ah, yes, apologies. I couldn't recall.
Perhaps my prince recalls when I knocked him off his horse.
Mother trucker, dude! That hurt like a butt cheek on a stick.
Truth be told, The Rogue's Prince is filled with talky scenes where the quality of the talk just doesn't pass the muster for me. The episode's first dialogue-heavy moment between Viserys and his soon-to-be child bride Alicent is intriguing enough, even if we learn the devastating information that Viserys isn't a master of craftsmen and it's the stonemasons who have erected his old Valyria model. But after that, the usual people talking in rooms approach lacks the clever repartee and the kinetic energy that the Game of Thrones world is capable of doing. Forgive me for the potential hyperbole that I'm about to say, but Viserys' brief conversation with his Master of Laws, Lord Lionel Strong, might be among the least interesting and the least unnecessarily House of the Dragon scenes ever filmed. House Targaryen's precious progenitorial position has already been made clear through conversations with Lord and Lady Valerian about joining their houses, and an extra chat with Lionel only serves to remind us that Lionel's exist and his house will be playing a role in the wars to come. At this point, perhaps I'm coming down too hard on this episode, which despite its faults, it's still a perfectly entertaining episode. The production value here is so high and George Martin's original tale is so rich that it's probably not possible for House of the Dragon to turn into a truly bad episode. This one, however, comes far closer than it has any right to. If anything, it makes both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon's previous triumphs in forms of storytelling seem all more impressive. When much of your plot relies on people in rooms talking, the razor's edge that separates whether it's compelling or boring is simply the word they choose to say, and the words in this episode were just a bit off here. Thankfully, the conclusion to The Rogue's Prince suggests more visually dynamic days to come, though Corlys and Daemon's closing conversations is far too expository, and once again seems to separate under the latter days of Game of Thrones fast travel rules. It does set up the series' first proper martial conflict. The opening and closing shots of the very literally named warlord Kragas the Crab-Feeder Drahar surviving the destruction he has wrought are quite beautiful, and I know it's kinda disgusting, but the cinematography is just chef chef's kiss. Mwah. And no one can help imagine how much more beautiful they'd be if everything was consumed by dragon fire. And more importantly, there are important characters that aren't even born yet. There will be significant time jumps between episodes for a while. To be honest, writing this season must have been an enormous challenge, and so far, it looks like they've done a really good job. I get why some moments feel rushed and slow, but the alternative would be to set everything up in 1.5 or 2 seasons, not just one, because I don't think it's feasible for television. It'd be borderline impossible to maintain the tension and keep the interest of the casual viewers. I mean, George R.R. Martin wrote it as a history book written by a maester. If I remember it right, Fire and Blood covers about 150 years, and House of the Dragon will probably cover fewer than 30 years. It has some emotional elements for me at least, but it's nothing like A Song of Ice and Fire. In some places, there are quotes from important characters, but there's no back and forth dialogue. In other places, there are 2 to 3 different descriptions of an event because the maester's writing of books uses a fewer primary sources, which gives slightly different accounts of what happened. Some things happen behind closed doors without any witnesses, so we're just left with, we'll never know what took place, we can only guess based on what happens next. Anyway, to end this video, I'll just say this. It's easy for a history book to say this year these people were married, the next year their first child was born, 2 years after that X and Y happened, and so on and so forth, but it's a huge challenge to translate it to television. It can't be skipped because without these later parts, events won't be understandable and won't have an appropriate emotional impact. Certain events can be condensed, but the others just can't because there are children involved and some things just need to happen before they are born and they need to grow up a little. So far, episode 2 may not be as good as the premiere of episode 1, but it has its moments where it gets you really excited for the future of this new Game of Thrones series. Though I'm still not gonna give it a score just yet. Maybe when we get to episode 5, then I can properly assess the show, and until then, I'll see you guys on the next video. Stay safe and I love you all.